What was that last one? All right. This is how to take a story that you tell orally and then put it into writing. The first reason you might want to do that is so that you can remember the story. Just simply, you can remember the story. Uh, and you can do that in a bare bones style. They talk about making your notes of your oral story in writing as bare bones, just kind of like a simple outline or list of here's the point, first point of the story, here's the second, here's the third. Some people prefer to go ahead and write out the entire story, sentence by sentence, as much as possible. Uh, some people do an official outline. It's however you want to do it because it's for your personal file, for your memory, so that you'll remember. Like one thing I do is make sure I write down what my opening sentence is and what my final sentence is. And that way I've got those two sentences locked in, the bookends, and then I can ad lib the rest of it if I need to. Okay. That's keeping a personal file so that you can remember your story. Some people keep a video file for their own personal use. They record their story on their laptop or whatever, and then when they need to be reminded of how that story goes, then they just play themselves back telling that story. And some people even, I know Tim Lowry does this, he sometimes even tells the story in his hotel room as he's listening and watching himself on his laptop so that the story's fresh before he goes to the concert later that day. Okay. Another reason you might want to put an oral story into written form is to pass it on to family, especially personal stories, family stories. Uh, you, if you put it into written form, you then have the opportunity to add more specific data, which otherwise might be kind of boring in an oral story, but you can give some of that background family information that descendants might find helpful. And see, Gene Growth just arrived and missed the best part of this entire presentation.
It's recorded.
Now,
Not pass the test.
the next reason you might want to write down your oral story is to submit it for a contest. Now, a couple of us, anyway, in the room have submitted written stories to the Missouri Liars Contest. And I don't know how Bob does it, but what I do is I write the story as though I'm telling it as an oral story. Just, short sentences and very zipping right along. If I were to turn that into a written story, more of a literary work, then I would fill in a lot more details. But to pass on to the family, I'm sorry, to submit for the contest, you can also indicate your stage directions. Because again, this is for your personal use, perhaps. I have one that I put into written form for my own personal use, and I included stage directions for myself. Like at this point, I point, in this part of the story, I point off in that direction, or I need to look at a certain spot, So, and what I do in my written format is bracket, not parentheses, but bracket the stage directions for myself. That's just how I do it. If you want to do that, you can do it any way you want because it's just for you. Now, if you also could do a more literary style if you're putting this story in written format to submit for a contest. My story about how Branson became the music capital of the country, the true story. If I ever tell that orally, there are some pieces of it that I will not tell orally because it just kind of drags on a bit in some places for an oral story. Because there is a significant difference between a written story and an oral story. Now, think about when you've read a book and then you go see the movie that was made from that book. There's a difference because it's two different formats of storytelling. And the written form has the opportunity to put in so much more detail. But if you're telling it orally, you have about 30 seconds to capture your audience's attention. 30 seconds. And if you do not get them within that 30 seconds, you're going to have a hard time getting them involved in your story. So you jump right in, or as Beth Horner says, parachute in. Just parachute into the story. Leave out all the stuff at the front that you might want people to know, but really it's not important for the arc of the story in an oral story, so you just jump right in. You can get into much more detail in your opening if you're writing. Charles Dickens has what I consider one of the best openings of all time, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. That's all one sentence. And superlative, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Now, I would not start an oral story with that much words and no action going on yet. I started reading a novel recently, and I got to page 100 before there was really any action going on. and and I almost put the book away, and then but it was recommended, and I thought, okay, there's something here. And finally I got to what I considered was a plot development. Something's going to happen to one of these characters. By golly, finally. I knew all about the characters, but now something's going to happen. Of course, in our oral storytelling, we get to that something's happening. We get right to that. Also, if you put it in written form as a literary style, you get to put breaks in, chapters. You can break it up. Another thing you get to do more easier. Another thing you get to do that is easier in written form than oral is flashbacks. You have to be very careful about flashbacks, because even in the written form, that can be confusing if it's not handled well. So be careful about that. And in written form, you usually do fill in the details. My story, Feral Hogs, A Tall Tale, is an oral story. If I ever put that into a formal written style, I would describe that those hogs that are on my 10 acres of land that end up eating cabbage are actually belted Hampshire hogs. But I do not include that in the story because everybody that hears the oral story gets to decide what kind of pigs I am feeding the cabbage to. And most of the comments I get are that people are picturing them as the white pigs. Actually, they're belted Hampshires, which are the black ones with a white belt around the neck. Now, many of the oral storytellers publish their stories. Like I said, there's a whole collection of those at Woodneath Library. And most libraries have some, or you can buy from some of the nationally known storytellers. They often will put together a grouping of their own stories in writing and publish those. And a lot of those are done kind of just how they tell it orally. But there are situations where they've had to make adjustments. Bill Lepp talks about how he turned his story, The King of Little Things, which he told at a motel concert last year, I believe it was. Uh, he has turned that into a children's book. But in order to get that published, he had to make some changes to the story so that it would be for an audience of children. Whereas when he tells it orally, the audience is often adults. And so there were things that he changed, some little things he changed, so that it would be appropriate for little ones. Another reason you might want to put your oral story into written form is like what Bill Lepp did for publication. If you're going to do that, the first thing is to research the publication for the style of stories that they want. What are the rules for submission? Because this is if you're going with a magazine or a book, to be part of a book or a magazine, find out what their rules are and you have to follow those. And they will let you know that, yes, we will take stories up to this maximum number of words, and know their publication well enough that you know who their audience is. You know, do they write or do they publish stories for adults only or for people of all ages, for children only? Do they publish stories about the great outdoors or about history? Or are they reminiscing stories from the past? You know, so find out, and that's what you submit. Don't submit anything else or you're wasting your time probably. Follow the rules. If you're going to self-publish, which is the big thing now, and I have to tell you, I've got a couple of things that are self-published and I'm not a big fan of it because the bottom line with self-publishing, you don't know if you're a good writer. And I have read some good self-published work, and I have read some not so good self-published work. I have read some self-published work that had basic grammar problems. They could not get the subject and verb to agree. You know, just basic grammar. So if you're going to self-publish and you know that you are not up on grammar, then the best advice is to pay someone to be an editor for you. And there are people that you can hire as editors, and they will edit your work and make suggestions about what needs to be changed to make it more clear, to make it more accurate. But like I said, I've read some self-publishing things that, you know, I wrote like that when I was in the 3rd grade. And hopefully advanced beyond that somewhere through the years. So those are kind of just the simple things of to take an oral story and put it in writing and why you might even want to do that. Questions?